Hello and welcome to the TelecomTV Summit on Open RAN. I'm Guy Daniels, Director of Content, and coming up now is our roundtable discussion on the commercial viability of Open RAN. With more trials under their belts, operators have more data on the technical performance of Open RAN. But what about the economics behind it? Does the approach make sense financially? And what further development work is required to secure its long-term commercial viability? Well, let's find out what our guests think, and I am delighted to introduce Neil McRae, Managing Director and Chief Architect at BT, Terje Jensen, SVP, Head of Global Network Architecture and Director of the 5G Readiness Strategic Programme, Technologies and Services at Telenor, Colin Bryce, Senior Director, Product Line for CommScope, John Baker, SVP, Business Development for Mavenir, and Timon Sloane, VP Marketing and Ecosystem for the Open Networking Foundation. Well, hello everyone, very good to see you all again. Thanks for taking part in the programme. Now, not a week goes by without TelecomTV reporting on Open RAN developments, trials, operator interest, vendor innovations, etc. Right now, based on the evidence from these trials, what do you see is the actual commercial viability of Open RAN? And John, perhaps I could ask you this first.
Yeah, great to be with you again. So really to start off with, I think, one thing that gets lost in the whole discussion on Open RAN is that, Open RAN is as much about vendor diversification as it is about the cost and technical viability. It's about expanding the marketplace. But as we've moved forward with this journey over the last 2 to 3 years, we've gone from trial and it is actually going into commercial deployments. So we have real hard facts. We've seen Rapitan's deployment. We now well into the beta testing of the Dish network, which will get launched very soon. And there's a number of other networks that are going commercial. So people are accepting the commercial viability of the Open RAN ecosystem and the Open RAN architectures to be deployed, and to that extent, coming up with new ways of deploying these networks, albeit adding the cloud aspects from like Amazon and others. So and finally, the FCC in the US has just been through a fairly extensive exercise in terms of the rip and replace, in terms of benchmarking closed proprietary solutions and Open RAN solutions side by side. And, through the publication of the cost catalog, which can be downloaded from the FCC website, has shown a 40% CapEx saving of closed systems against Open RAN solutions. So, there's some hard numbers there, and obviously, there's a lot of intangibles as well in terms of services cost, operational costs that will come into this as well. But, we're now starting to see hard evidence that, Open RAN is equal and better than, the closed proprietary technology solution. Again, more of this is about, vendor diversification and ensuring that we've got suppliers for the future.
Well, thanks, John. And as you say, it's the hard evidence we're looking for to see just how viable all this is. Colin, let me come across to you for some more comments.
Yes, I think we can make some comments as a sort of second-tier vendor in the Open RAN space, i.e. we're not planning to be a system integrator, but certainly delivering product into the market. And we've been tracking the readiness on a sort of eight-legged spider chart, if you like, not only looking at the product, so the disaggregated baseband, the radio, and the RIC, but also looking at the ecosystem around that, so the cloud orchestration, compliance testing, system integration, test equipment availability, and silicon. And I think we've seen huge progress in most of those areas. And we're fairly happy that in terms of the legacy markets, and by that I mean 2G to 4G and up to 4T, 4R radio, we're on the cusp of commercial deployment, unquestionably. I think we're still probably a year to 18 months away from 5G comparability with the OEMs, particularly in areas for us as a radio vendor like massive MIMO and beam steering, beam forming, beam management aspects. And also, I think we still have some question marks about the ecosystem's ability to do regression testing, backward compatibility testing, all the things that we take for granted from an OEM today. I think are certainly achievable, but probably need a little bit more cooperation going forward. But unquestionably, I think if you want to deploy a legacy ORAN solution, we're very close, if not already at the point where it can be done.
Great, thanks Colin. Well, this discussion is all about the commercial viability of Open RAN. We're going to be exploring that over the next 25, 30 minutes or so. But let me, Terje, I'm going to come to you in a moment, but let me first of all come to Timon.
Yeah, so I think it's important to remember that there are multiple facets of Open RAN, and there's sort of the horizontal disaggregation of the RU-DU-CU, and I think that we've already seen commercial deployment of those components, open front haul and the separation of the DU and CU. And we're a little further away from the vertical disaggregation of the RIC and the XApps and sort of the SDNization, if you will, of the RAN. But I think we're making amazing strides, and I don't know if you caught it, but just very recently, ONF with Deutsche Telekom just announced a very large field trial of Open RAN. They actually mix and match sort of 8 different components together. So I think we're going to see it in phases, is really the bottom line. And you're asking about commercialization. It's going to start in the baseband disaggregation, but it's moving really rapidly and very exciting progress across the board.
Yeah, thanks, Timon. That does look like an absolutely fascinating trial, which will keep our eyes closely peeled on developments there. Terje, let me come and pick up the comments from you.
Yeah, just shortly, I would just add on to the previous 2 gentlemen. So I fully agree on that. I think we have seen indication that it's commercially viable. But I think it's very important to what also mentioned lastly on that there are quite a few different deployment cases. So of course, Open RAN is not one thing. It can be deployed and used in various ways. And there are also quite a few components of the Open RAN. I think was mentioned both on the horizontal and vertical, and there are quite a few controller, radio elements, and so forth. And all these kind of things, of course, needs to be looked into and see what kind of where they fit into the different deployment cases. So just, I guess we'll come back to that later in the session. But of course, there are 2 different, very different kind of cases. For example, on the wide area network, which typically we talk about on the macro side with 2G, 3G, 4G, and 5G, and so on. But let's not forget about this kind of private networks, so enterprise specific customer networks and those kind of things, which also are deployment cases. And it might be that Open RAN can definitely play a role maybe earlier in some of these, because then we might talk about lower power, it could be lower capacity, depending, of course, of the customer needs and so on. So there are quite a few also interesting cases on for Open RAN to play with different, call it 5G use cases, or whatever we want to call it these days, when we are sitting down and talking with enterprise, for example, on their needs there.
Yeah, thanks, Terje. That's a good point. Now, labs and tests are all very well, but it's going to take some serious and deep commitment from a number of telcos to deploy Open RAN, which in turn should lead to a viable supplier and developer ecosystems. But can we leave it to just a few telcos, a few of the leading telcos, or do we need to see more telcos enter commercial service now? Colin, do we need to see an increase in the number of telcos pushing out Open RAN at least towards commercial operational status?
I think in terms of the telcos themselves, I think we see enough interest, enough drive in the market to push Open RAN forward. I mean, most of the major telcos are involved, and we recently saw the MOU come forward from the major European players. And we're certainly getting RFIs and questions from a range of operators in Europe, in the States, in Middle East, and in Asia. So I think the interest is there. What, as a vendor, we would like to see perhaps is a little more clarity in how the telcos intend to procure and manage and integrate the networks. We think Open RAN is going to evolve into a number of ecosystems. So a number of integrators who develop a solution with a range of partners. John earlier mentioned the Rakuten. We can see the RCPs beginning to do that around a set of vendors who have supported Rakuten, and that model can be rolled out elsewhere. But we'd love to understand how some of the other major telcos really intend to develop the supply chain. Are they going to be integrators themselves? Do they expect vendors to form these coalitions of groupings that will supply? And I think clarity in that aspect of the supply chain would be useful to us as a vendor.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. And it's just worth noting that we do have 2 dedicated panels coming up later in this summit, one on the ecosystem and one on integration. So maybe we'll get some more answers from those. Well, question is, does Open RAN make business sense? Have we got data yet on where the real savings are or new revenue gains? Are there real economic benefits to deploying Open RAN? Neil, let me come to you first on this one for your thoughts on this.
Sure. I mean, look, I think just listening to the answers from my colleagues here of where we are, we're still at the very early stages of Open RAN, I think it's fair to say. And different paths are starting to be put in front of us. Rakuten's one path, there's other integrators taking other paths. And I think over time, we see Open RAN developing into something very valuable. Right now, is it there in very specific use cases? Yes. Could we roll it out large style and maintain the performance of our network that we've got today? No, not at all. Not even close, in fact. So there's a lot of work going on, a lot of fantastic work, but there's still a hell of a lot to do. And I think from that perspective, when you start looking at how do you then take this forward and use it to generate value, it still feels some way off. It still feels way off that can we really see the reduction in costs and the improvement in performance that was kind of highlighted. And right now in our labs and the responses we've had from a number of vendors, it's just not quite there yet. It's not to say that what is available isn't good. Some of it's very good. But I still think we've got a long way to go before, you see the kind of mass adoption that something like 10% that Telenor talked about still feels some way off to me. And we're aggressively looking at this because of some of the requirements that the UK government's got, but it looks increasingly hard to get to the point where it's deployable. I think if we flip back to vendor diversity, which I think is increasingly important, even more so than it ever was, I think we start to see some more vendors enter this market and more wireless vendors start up, which I think is great. But I think there's still a long path for us to go before, I can walk into an Ericsson shop and pick something off the wall, plug it in, turn it on, and it works. I think we've still got some way to go before we're fully in that situation for all the needs of the network that we've got. But certain use cases, small cells in particular, some private network stuff, there's definitely opportunity there. I think it's then the next steps, which is how do we operate and run and manage this? And, if we've got a problem and there's 3 or 4 vendors involved, how do we debug it and how do we figure out, where's the issue or who's going to fix it? And I think that's the next big challenge for operators as this gets more maturity.
Thank you, Neil. Well, we do absolutely have to generate value here. Terje, let me come across to you as our other operator on the panel and get your views.
Yeah, no, I'm sharing the views of Neil on that. There is still a bit of maturing to happen here. I think so. We overestimate this, that it's maybe a year ahead. Where until the specifications are fully there. And then I think we are reading, in the media these days a lot about Open RAN and launches and pilots, but we can of course argue how open and really interoperable are the solutions. I think also Neil pointed to that on if you really want to choose 2 random players and then say that are they really working together. So that's kind of still to be validated in a larger scale. But if you come back to I think Guy, you had a question about the financials. So we have been playing a bit with the numbers, of course, and there are there are, of course, commercial discussions ahead of us on each of these different components. So break it down into, the capex on the software licenses and hardware, and also installation. And so it seems like, that is basically down to, okay, so how much can you get, in the commercial discussion? We can argue whether it should be really more expensive in terms of capex compared to the standard or the old way to build rounds. Of course, if you need to invest in fiber, it probably kills the whole case, so forget about it. So that's a kind of a joker in the whole discussion. Then what we have looked into is more on the OPEX, on the running cost elements, where we see that Open RAN, and if you start to do it and deploy these components a bit different than you do in traditionally, you can actually save quite some capacity on the sites out there. Of course, given that you have fiber all the way, so there are OPEX potentials there on both on the energy and the footprint, there's leases, and also on the operational sides, which clearly are in the favor of Open RAN as we see it. Of course, when it's maturing, then of course we can discuss about revenue. Is a bit more speculative as we see it. It's probably not only about Open RAN, but it's just as well about edge and private networks and what you do there. And lastly, I think the factor is what also Neil said about flexibility and potential future options, which is also one of and doing innovations, which is also one of the value drivers into this equation. But so I think there are indications, at least what we have come across, which are in the favor of Open RAN as concepts and as components. But there again, what I started with, as also Neil was saying, there is a bit of maturing, I think, on the specifications, and also to truly call it Open RAN in that sense.
Great, thanks, Terje. As you say, the revenue side is a little bit more speculative at this stage, but interesting, the potential focus and the savings on OPEX. John, I'm going to bring you in now for your thoughts on any economic benefits we're seeing from Open RAN deployments.
Yeah, I think, and again, I sort of just hop back on one of the points, that it takes many years in the sense of stabilizing a technology. And I think, to get forgotten in this discussion, obviously, I've spoken about the diversity of the supply chain, but then on the other side of it, technology-wise, what we're really talking about is the virtualization of the RAN. Open RAN doesn't dictate how you build a RAN. And so if I could just get public interfaces between the radio and the baseband unit, then I've got Open RAN. And to that extent, none of the economics change, none of the technology changes from what's being deployed today. The only issue is about open interfaces. So the reference point is there that, with building it with conventional custom hardware, but if I have an open interface, I've got the economics of it. Now, with virtualization, and I think as the last speaker said, that if I centralize some of these aspects of the virtualized RAN, then I obviously get some, what we call is the pooling effect, gives me some significant saving in terms of how to build the network. And, it's back to the 80-20 rule that, 80% of my network or 80% of my traffic is being carried by 20% of my cell sites. And to that extent, then, with the right licensing models and the right way to centralize some of the RAN functionality, then, I can get commonality across multiple cell sites and get cost savings there. And, we're starting to see that in some of the trial deployments that we actually have in place, and then this backs into the dish discussion and this announcement with AWS that AWS effectively starts to host the RAN, and suddenly the discussion moves away from a capex discussion to an OPEX discussion. And in a sense, I think the operator of the future doesn't necessarily own any of the assets of the RAN, as an extreme position, and where you're left with guys like Amazon, the tower companies building the infrastructure for the operator, and the operator obviously owns the software and maintains the quality of the network. But in a sense, there's a combination of new capex, OPEX elements in this that really do bring cost savings in the future. But that said, we're right at the front end of this. Then there's been multiple interoperability testing going on between vendors, and with Mavenir, AutoStar, 10 different radio vendors per se, doing interoperability testing. And I think that's one of the things that Dish is holding very high to the standards of doing cross-compatibility testing of multiple radio manufacturers and multiple CDU suppliers, and doing it across multiple frequency bands. So the situation is quite complex, but the cost savings are going to come out of it. And I think you're going to see new business models of actually how to build and operate network coming out of this as well, which and I can imagine in a few months' time, CFOs are going to be sitting there saying, well, why can't we do this? There's some game-changing decisions that have been made, and if they come to fruition, then I think it's going to change the industry going forward.
Thank you, John. We're always looking out for the new business models, and we're going to be doing a lot more on this next year on TelecomTV. Colin, let me come up to you first for some more thoughts on the economic benefits.
Listening to John, I think I agree with him in the sense that a large, when we look back in 5-10 years, a large part of the impact of Open RAN will be around the disaggregation, the virtualization, and I think I think the most exciting thing really is the RIC in the terms of how that can change the way we operate and manage networks, and the way we can apply our apps, X apps, and bring new services and things quickly. I go to the other end though. If I look at what's the ultimate object of a RAN, it's to deploy thousands, tens of thousands of remote entities across a country in a harsh environment where it's snowing one day, sunny the next day. Keeping them environmentally clear, making sure that the failure rates out the box, don't ruin deployment plans, making sure that these things will last for 5 or 10 years. And I don't think we should underestimate the amount of engineering work that's done on those non-telecoms, non-electronics, non-software aspects of a RAN. If you end up having to go visit your site, after it's been deployed, you've kind of killed any economics in a 10 or 20% capex saving of buying the unit. And having worked on that aspect of the business for years, generally in the early days, most of the complaints were around leaking cabinets, rusting cabinets, cabinets in dust ingress. Those things we need to make sure we don't forget, and we don't forget the lessons that we've learned over 20 years in this industry as we bring new players to the market. So I just make a plea that there are some fundamentals that still need to be applied to an Open RAN base station.
Great, thanks for those comments, Colin. Absolutely right. Neil, we started this question coming to you, so let's circle back for some final comments from you on this one about the economic benefits.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think my version of hell was just described by one of the previous speakers. So I'll take you back to a time where a lot of mobile operators outsourced everything, and it was probably the time where the value of customers was forgotten about, and this was coming towards the middle of the 3G days, and everyone outsourced everything. We outsourced it to vendors, we outsourced it to integrators, and the last thing we were thinking about was customers. And the last thing I'm going to be doing is outsourcing or moving stuff to people who don't understand my customers, don't understand the technology and the technology requirements I've got to make the service work at the right level of experience. And what was described was that version of hell for me. And more importantly for our customers. So, whilst virtualization is a really useful tool, in fact, actually you can buy RAN today that's virtualized. It's not a new thing. It's been around for a while. There are savings to be made in certain circumstances in certain markets. One size doesn't fit all. But I think, this is the thing I get frustrated about the most, as you can tell. When we stop thinking about the customer, it doesn't matter what all this other value brings, because the customers aren't going to care that we're vRAN or we're not, or we're Open RAN or we're not. What they care about is the quality of the service, how you're managing it, how you're making sure that the coverage is there and that you're rolling out in coverage. And actually the part of Open RAN that excites me the most is the RIC side of it, because I think there we can think much more about customers. We can think much more about how the service is performing. We can do things with the network that we haven't been able to do before. And that's where I think we need to put more of our focus on that aspect of it and how we can make the network even better. My vision of the network is every minute it gets more entwined with our lives and adds value to our lives. And that means for me, the network's going to be super reliable. It's going to be everywhere where people need it. And it's going to be at a price point and a value point that people can afford to use it so that they can get things out of it. And for us as operators, we've got to be able to make a return on it so we can invest in the next set of technologies. And when I hear hyperscalers that are so expensive to work with, I really struggle to think if people are really doing the maths on this, because it feels really difficult to even kind of head down that path. I don't know, maybe I'm missing something, but when we do the sums to do that, it doesn't come out as something that's even remotely workable.
Thank you, Neil. Yes, we've had this discussion about the costs and doing the maths on the cloud, and we will be coming back to this. Have no fear, we will be investigating. Now, moving on, Timon, Neil earlier mentioned some stats from the Telenor group, and they reported only about a month ago that Open RAN revenues are expected to account for over 10% of the overall RAN market by about 2025, so just in a few years' time. And they revised their original projections upwards, so heading this direction. Does that sound sort of in line with your own observations?
I think it does. I'm not surprised to see the numbers going up. I think we heard a couple times today from a number of the panelists about the potential for Open RAN in the enterprise and the private 5G space. And I think that should not be overlooked. And I think that's a big part of what's going to drive numbers and also earlier numbers. Remember, these are essentially greenfield networks. They're smaller, they're simpler networks, they're small cell based. And so I think there's pretty broad consensus growing that Open RAN has a place in these markets, and that's maybe where it gets its first real foothold and real volumes. And then it will, without doubt, kind of grow into the macro deployments and the telco deployments and whatnot. But I think to some degree the enterprise is what's helping to push those numbers forward. And to that end, I don't know if you saw, but ONF, we're a nonprofit. We just recently spun out a commercial entity to make it easier for enterprises and for the market serving the private enterprise 5G space to be able to deploy 5G solutions. Just trying to address some of the other concerns that were raised by panelists today. The simplicity or the complexity of deployment, to try to make it consumable as a service, plug and play. And to eliminate the need to assemble solutions of various components, but at the same time leveraging Open RAN and all the Open RAN capabilities. We think that we've also heard people talking about the value of the brick, and we're huge believers in that. One way to think of it is that spectrum is the most valuable asset that operators have, perhaps only second to the customers, to Neil's point. So the RIC and the XApp, are opening up the possibility of being able to really optimize the spectrum, optimize the RAN, and unlock, an incredibly valuable and limited constrained resource that the operators have. So all these things really are coming together, and I think that that's what leads to people like Telenor starting to increase their projections.
Thanks, Timon. Terje, let's come to you for thoughts on the market penetration of Open RAN.
Yeah, no, I will be quite short, I think. So we are also looking into different scenarios. I think it's very important what also was mentioned recently, that we need to keep in mind that there are quite a few different deployment cases, both in the wide area network and in the private network. And what we see is that the volumes, I think, when it comes to Open RAN, is probably a bit back to how we define Open RAN and how many generations will be part of the Open RAN family. Will it be 5G, 4G, and how much of 2G, for example, will be there? And then, of course, also how successful the operators or the other actors will, for example, be in the private network cases. So I think it's a bit back, very much back on to timing in the different markets, on how quickly we can start doing this, for example, on the enterprises, and also how quickly, what happening on the hardware side. I think we have a discussion with Neil some months back on the maturing there as well, particularly on the most advanced cases. We then talking about massive MIMO and so on. But there are quite a few cases, I think, where we see that Open RAN has a position and a place to play, actually, in particular when it comes to the private networks and some of the rural cases there. But we would also like definitely to see more generations into the package, so we don't have to do a specific 5G on the side of 4G, because we don't really get the full benefit out of that. Then just a quick comment from myself, my side as well. I fully support what Neil is saying, that please also remember the customer perspective here. I mean, not going to squeeze, the last euro out of the Open RAN if you're losing, the customer experience. So we are going to still, have a quite a bit conservative on the side on configuration. We have been looking into, for example, how much overbooking or the pooling effect we can go out of that, and it's. We can have a discussion, I think, on how much we would like to squeeze out of this, because it's only one component, and if you're taking it too far, the customer could be gone the next day. So that's a kind of the risky part of squeezing all these kind of out of the technical systems.
Absolutely, thanks, Terje. Neil, you brought up the Dell'Oro stats. I forgot to ask you. Do you agree with them? Are they in line with what you think?
I think I agree with the general direction, Guy. What I'm not so sure about is, will it be private networks? And the reason I question that is, so we work in BT Global with the largest users of telecommunications. We run massive networks all over the world, and usually with those customers, they've got kind of an inkling of the solution they want to deploy. So I have a customer who says, "Hey, BT, we want to buy an SD-WAN from you, and we want it to be Nokia." Or, "Hey, BT, we want to buy a LAN solution, and we want it to be McRae." So my worry there is do customers out in the world actually understand Open RAN in a way that allows us to sell it to them? And I think we've got to figure out how we get that story straight for customers, or I think they'll just buy Nokia or Cisco or Ericsson because no one got fired for buying that, and we'll have to manage it. So, getting our end user story about the value of Open RAN is where I think we need to do a much better job. It's not actually, let me rephrase that. We haven't done a bad job. We just haven't been focused enough on it, and probably at this stage quite rightly so. But as I said, customers come to, when they talk to us about building them networks across the world, they usually kind of have a view of what supplier they want to work with. Sometimes frustratingly so, because what they want isn't actually what's best for them. But you work with the customer to try and build the solution they need. So let's hope that we get that end story that shows value about Open RAN and the great companies that are working on Open RAN, because there's some fantastic companies that are involved in it and doing some great things, but they're fighting against massive marketing budgets and 20 or 30 years of choices that those customers have made. So I don't think it'll be. I'm not sure it'll be private networks, but I think 10% from the rest of everything else, then yeah, for sure, possibly. Put it this way: if it isn't 10%, then you have to think what the future of Open RAN is. Because I think at this stage, if we're not getting to that sort of scale, then something isn't working right.
Yeah, it's got to be upwards of 10%, Neil. Absolutely right. John, let me come across to you for some extra thoughts on the penetration, really, of Open RAN.
Yeah, I think having been deeply involved in these discussions on a daily basis and seeing what's going behind some of the numbers, and Japan really is sort of leading out there and is really pushing into those numbers, and because Japan has really taken an open approach, not just with Rakuten, but in the other networks there, then they fall into the Open RAN classification, and so that's part of why you're seeing the numbers going the way they are. But I think to Neil's point, about don't forget the customer, and I think you're exactly right. And I think having built networks myself and operated networks, it is all about the customer. And I think this whole issue of Open RAN versus proprietary, is obviously a very hot subject, and that's the reason we're here today. But personally, and I think, as a little bit of provocative statement, I think operators are spending too much time around the technology in their network, and rather than focusing on, what does a customer really need from a service perspective. And I think that's where the sort of debate is sort of got a little bit out of perspective. And, I think, and again, sort of a little bit provocative here, if the operators really held their position around open interfaces like they've done in Japan, then, is it 10%? Is it 50%? I think it's, again, getting more vendors to be able to supply products against open and interoperable interfaces. And then, within the next 5 years, 50% or 70% of all new deliveries could be Open RAN. And, it's just really how the operators are corralling the vendors, if you like, into producing part that, diversifies the supply chain, allows innovation. And so, I see, I sort of agree with where the Deloro numbers are going. I've seen some even bigger numbers that are being floated around, but until you sort of get a mass scale deployment going on, then as Neil said, it's some of the things are still very questionable about where Open RAN will really go. But I think from a customer perspective, and certainly as a customer of mobile networks, I'd like to see what 5G really is. What is a real 5G service? And get it at a reasonable price. And I think, hopefully, this Open RAN debate will soon get into a steady state. And, then we can focus on the value of the RIC and what RIC can do for me as a customer, and what, can truly come out of having some real innovation in services in these networks.
Thank you, John. Well, I hate to bring this lively discussion to an end, but we have almost outstayed our welcome. We're going to have to continue the discussion later today in the after show, and we've got plenty more panels, and we'll be covering the RIC in depth, of course. So thank you all very much for participating today and sharing your views and opinions. And if you're watching this on day one of our TelecomTV Summit on Open RAN, then don't forget, please send us any questions you have and we'll try and answer them in our live after show program, and that's later today. And please take part in our online poll. You can find it below this video player window next to the Q&A app. All of today's programs will be available to view online here at TelecomTV, and we'll be back tomorrow with more roundtable discussions for you. Until then, thanks for watching. Goodbye.